This is Adventures in Vinyland, where we take a look at record releases of the past, the present, and maybe even the future. I'm your host, Randy, and today we'll be talking about what is easily the most obscure band I've ever covered here. Every music fan has their collection of favorite albums. You'll find the common classics like The Beatles, Radiohead, and Pink Floyd, as well as underground classics such as Godspeed You Black Emperor and Neutral Milk Hotel. Then there's the oddly specific selections that make you question the person's sanity. Like my friend Phil, who has a 50 Cent album on his list. Today's album is one of those weird little selections for me. This is The Death of Cool by Kitchens of Distinction. For the 90% of you watching this video that are unfamiliar, Kitchens of Distinction are a shoegazing / dream pop outfit started in 1986. They had the atmospheric guitars, dreamy vocals, and pop sensitivities common in the genre. What Kitchens lacked in genre innovation, they made up for with songwriting. Where their contemporaries were obsessed with big, loud walls of sound, Kitchens focused on chord changes, song structures, and meaningful lyrics. Vocalist Patrick Fitzgerald is arguably the best lyricist in the genre, and that's saying a lot given the great shoegazing lyricists. The band got its start when Dan Goodwin and Julian Swales teamed up with Fitzgerald. They were influenced by the likes of the Chameleons, the Church, and the Smiths. The latter found its way into Fitzgerald's vocals and lyrics. They got their name from a store that specialized in kitchen fixtures. What the hell were they thinking? I love these guys, but goddamn, it's up there with Toad the Wet Sprocket and Neutral Milk Hotel. At least Toad was a self-aware Monty Python joke, and NMH were an ironic hipster band. This was just an overly complicated name. The trio released a handful of singles that caught the attention of NME and One Little Indian Records, who signed them in 1988. This caught the members off guard, as they didn't consider the band as anything more than a hobby. Fitzgerald was finishing up his studies to become a medical doctor at the time, meaning he was either in his late 20s or early 30s. The band was hyped, with publications calling them a potential voice of a generation. Despite the hype they garnered, success slowed to a crawl. The first singles they released under the label were critically acclaimed and charted relatively high. Their first album, Love As Hell, was only popular among indie circles, especially shoegazers who admired the experimentation with effects pedals. Their second album, Strange Free World, saw better sales and featured even more pedals. By 1991, One Little Indian were begging for a hit record for Kitchens' third album. Fitzgerald was stuck between the pressure from the label and the desire to create a work of art. His inspiration came from a painful time in history. Fitzgerald was openly gay, which helped the band gain a mild LGBT fan base. The previous decade was devastating. The AIDS epidemic was at its worst, and the diagnosed were left with no cure. While it's true that straight people were more commonly diagnosed, the most oppressed and publicized were gay men. Norms of the day were different. Condoms were mostly used to avoid pregnancy, as most STDs were seen either as just an annoyance or as easily treatable. AIDS was an unprecedented beast. Those that tested positive with the HIV virus were given basically 10 years to live if they were lucky. Since gays didn't have to worry about pregnancy, they were even less likely to use condoms. Unfortunately, it increased the spread in the gay population. The general public blamed them, with politicians trying to pass discriminatory laws. As the 90s came in, even with the introduction of AZT, things looked grim. 1991 saw more deaths than the previous years, with over 20,000 known deaths in the US alone. Fitzgerald felt like a message needed to be made. Influences came from his peers. He wanted to draw mainstream attention to the struggles of the gay man with AIDS. The songs became brooding and dark, and the label didn't care much for it. They wanted a hit, and asked the band to select the most accessible song on the album. Kitchens selected Breathing Fear, which was about gay bashing. The Death of Cool was released on August 3rd, 1992 to little fanfare. Critics loved it, but audiences ignored it. Shoegazing was a dying fad, with Loveless by My Bloody Valentine crushing all competition. The front depicts the Mayan calendar, which symbolized the end of times, only 20 years away from when Death of Cool was released. The artwork is far removed from the neon colors of the previous two. This is a concept album about AIDS and gay culture. The band is not very popular, so finding decent lyrical interpretations is hard. I'll do my best to interpret this myself, but some of these are very vague. It's been said that this album is a rock opera, meaning that it tells a story. If it does, I don't see it. Fitzgerald has never even hinted that it is one. It's just a fan theory. So I will be reviewing this as just a concept album, not a rock opera. Now let's get this thing spinning and see how deep the rabbit hole goes. The album starts with What Happens Now, a song that describes a young man's confusion with society.
Don't understand how it changed, not sure I'll ever know. It's all circles, colliding spheres. I close off, chaos appears.
The reverb-slathered guitars play a standard rock rhythm at first, but effects are added as the narrator falls into greater confusion. The lyrics in the chorus beg for the simplicity of childhood to return. The questions get more desperate as the song ends. For Men starts with a wail from Fitzgerald and hard-hitting drums. It's about a man's difficulty coming to terms with homosexuality as he finds himself falling in love with a gay man. The narrator longs for his muse. The verses are sung with frantic, nervous self-loathing. In the bridge, the guitars disappear for a split second for Fitzgerald to take the spotlights, with the narrator finally making peace.
I'll crush my arms around, I'll melt inside of you. Oh God, I want you, and I'll have you. I'll be your son, your slave and keeper.
On Tooting Broadway Station was written after a tough breakup Fitzgerald had. The narrator goes to London's Tooting Broadway Station to contemplate.
On Tooting Broadway Station, I knelt down and wept. My hands hit the concrete floor until my fingers bled.
The chorus shows a sense of rage and a desire to cleanse himself of the man who deserted him.
Burn, burn his clothes, burn everything he owned, and the empty chamber left.
The sorrow and anger expressed in the song shows how beautiful, passionate love can crumble to nothing.
Burn, burn it all, burn it all, benedictine fire, blessing of these burns. Burn it all, burn it all, benedictine fire, blessing of these burns.
Next, we have the lead single on the album, Breathing Fear. As I said, this one is about gay bashing. The style is basic alt-rock, but the lyrics describe a man who is hiding bruises and making excuses.
But when boy arrives, she's got a black eye, and the lads who play this outside, he laughs, calls for the world to die, then hugs and kisses it better.
He gets vengeful and angry, asking the world why gays have been discriminated throughout history.
Tell it why do you go to extremes, and how it must show.
It's a short burst that leaves a strong impression, especially with the closing words. Gone World Gone starts with a light drum solo, joined by bass and shimmering guitar effects. Fitzgerald's vocals are whispered, drenched in echo, and barely comprehensible. It appears to be about a man's dream of coping with an AIDS diagnosis. He sees images of animals protecting him, symbolizing a partner. He whispers of longing for sleep, as it's one of the few times he gets to be his true self, away from the world that persecutes him. The man is brought deeper into his torture as the effects overtake the music. He begs for the current cruel world to crumble before he dies, as he feels trapped. When in Heaven is the most upbeat song on the album. It's about Marilyn Monroe in heaven, where everything is perfection. It's possible that Marilyn symbolizes the lucky who don't have to live in fear of the disease.
When Marilyn Monroe woke up in heaven, she had everything she'd need for the perfect day.
Down on Earth, the gays with AIDS are begging for a cure.
But down here, we're dreaming of cures and drinking well tonight.
They make promises to not sleep with anyone and spread disease.
We sit in the pub, waiting for the clubs to open. We will be safe tonight, not wake up next to strangers, thinking I killed the one I loved.
Rather than suffer in their sadness, they fantasize what will happen when they go to heaven.
When I go to heaven and stand shivering before this God, I'll try some complaining. Why that little tiny trick?
The dance rhythm and wild effects reflect the culture of the time, as raves were starting to become popular, especially among gays.
Give me another chance, a beautiful set of wings in heaven.
Mad as the Snow is a deeply depressing yet comforting song. My guess is that it's about a straight acquaintance that found Fitzgerald in the midst of sadness and comforted him.
It's okay, I promise I'll stay. Turn down the lights, I'll sit with you, we'll talk like we're friends. Tell me where this troubled love began.
It appears to be coming from a position of someone who is not used to this, maybe almost unaccepting of it. The narrator says that stress is just like the snow. It can't truly hurt you, as it doesn't last forever.
We can count the flakes as it snows and snows. We can't get hurt. It melts and fades.
The music is slow and soothing, like a friend when you need it most. Smiling is a short song about not letting a death sentence keep you from living the rest of your life in happiness. It tells the story of a straight couple who seem to be diagnosed with AIDS.
Now the sunset, was it very, very good? Shall we get really high? She says I stay alive, it's the best thing, the only thing I know.
They both have learned that all they can do is survive and make the best out of the rest of the time that they have left.
He smiles, tells her she looks lovely, anything can be done. She looks up and laughs, he says I stay alive, it's the best thing, the only thing I can give.
Sometimes the only thing you can do is smile and be grateful for what you have, even in the darkest of times.
She says, why do I want more than good looks? Why do I want more than great books? Is that all there is? Is that all it is? She smiles and stays alive. It's the best thing, the only thing she can do.
Blue Petal is the darkest song on the album. Fitzgerald sings of bright times that once were, but now the plague has come.
All that was gold has lost its shine.
It's saying that the disease does not discriminate, as the grooving bass and jazz drums sway like a pendulum. Fitzgerald sings a complicated melody that only grows more tense.
Press the cooling pedal of
The album reaches its climax, talking about the death of our kind, referring to the loss of gays.
good fed on these deaths of our kind.
The effects come bursting out, symbolizing the unknown. He says that some have been selected to recover, referring to the few who could afford the AZT drug. Can't Trust the Waves closes the album on a positive note. It's directed at someone that comforts the narrator.
When I look at you, your brilliant smile stops time and intoxicates me.
The flowing melody and waltz rhythm give hope after nearly an album of dark themes.
I can lose myself in moments of you. Nothing ripples, nothing sways. This tender love feeds my days.
The song is short, but effectively closes the album. This is one of my all-time favorite shoegazing albums. It's up there with Savlaki, Loveless, and Nowhere, but you never hear anyone mention it. It's a top contender for one of the greatest albums of the 90s. It paints a stark picture of a time when humanity's future was uncertain, a glorified era painted with colors of revolution and rebellion. I highly recommend giving it a listen. It had the balls to tackle a subject that many in the music industry pranced around at best. Now this thing is pretty tough to get on vinyl, at least for the next 2 months. It barely sold, and of course this was during the dark ages of vinyl, as they call them, like between the late 80s to the early 2000s when vinyl was barely selling. And on top of that, it was distributed by a very small record label in comparison to the bigger ones. So yeah, this thing's pretty tough to get a hold of. And the reason... Now, getting this thing on vinyl is pretty tough. It was released by a small-ish record label, and this was during the dark ages of vinyl, as they call them, between the late 80s and the early 2000s, when vinyl was a dead and or dying medium. Now, I was lucky to get a hold of this for the price that I did. The seller was only asking for about 25 bucks, citing some slight damage to the upper seam here. And to be honest, it's such minimal damage that he probably could have sold this for a lot more than he did. I only spent about 25 bucks on it. They could have easily pushed this up to 50, maybe even 60, 70 bucks. It is rare. However, there is a reissue on its way in January that'll much likely alleviate this issue, and it's probably going to be 180 gram with remastered sound quality, but it's pretty cool that I'm able to hold an original in my possession, considering most original copies of classic shoegazing albums, especially My Bloody Valentine's Loveless, go way up and beyond most prices that you're going to spend of vinyl, even from this particular era when vinyl wasn't as commonly available. Anyways, that about does it for this episode. Join me next time when I talk about my very first country music album. See you later.